This wouldn't be the first time that I've spoken about the Matthew effect, sometimes called the Matthew principle. This notion based upon the Bible from Matthew that to those who have, all shall be given, and those who have not, all shall be taken. But it well encapsulates the principle behind it, first coined in the 60s by a sociologist, and essentially describes that individuals born with certain advantages tend to have more advantages conferred upon them as they get older and older, and this redounds to their ultimate benefit over time. And the people who have fewer advantages have less of it. It's that simple. But it's not something talked about in the mainstream. It's not something really talked about much at all. Because most people think, most normies as it were, that your life is this thing that you can intervene in anytime you want, on a whim, almost, and change it fundamentally. They don't look at your past particularly as being influential. I mean, some of them do. They might talk about quote-unquote trauma or something that's happened to you. But they don't realize that the cumulative effects of the benefits you receive or the disadvantages you receive have a massive impact on the outcomes in your life. And this leads to a great deal of misunderstanding. Why certain individuals succeed, why they don't, is in part mysterious and in part not, as is the environment that someone is exposed to when one is very young. But the details are not known. But nonetheless, people think that, generally speaking, people have a lot of options to make changes, and they can essentially be whatever they want. Obviously, this isn't true. But in the context of the Matthew principle, I would say that there's something else that needs to be observed here, because it specifically concerns this issue of struggle and hardship. Because no one's life is a straight arrow where they have 100% success. There might be some exceptions. When we're talking about this, we're really talking about overall, in general, majority good things versus overall majority bad things. When, for the majority of your life, you've benefited from a variety of positive effects in this Matthew effect loop, then I would argue you accumulate reserve energy that you can use for a later date. A good example of this would be someone I encountered fairly recently, a very, very intelligent, capable person who was doing a PhD in mathematics, who at that point in time had some serious depression issues related to the department he was studying, the people there, as well as his supervisor. And he was depressed and having some occasional thoughts of self-deletion, but had a great track record. Studying at one of the top universities, mathematics, PhD, that already says a lot. So tremendous IQ, tremendous cognitive ability, and also very hardworking, so conscientious, all these things. Eventually, long story short, he realized that it wasn't for him, and he got a job as a data science engineer making good money and just doing well. So up until that point where he had this crisis of what he wanted to do, and by the way, he was only about 21 or 22 when he was struggling through this PhD, which is pretty early to do a PhD, let alone in a subject with the difficulty of mathematics. Things were going reasonably well. He had a rough spot for 2 or 3 years, but he got out of it. Now, when an individual has that much success in life, what happens, as I said, is there are reserves built there. It's difficult, but he can tap into these reserves. There is an end point. He can see a light at the end of the tunnel. But why can he see a light at the end of the tunnel? Because he has been basking in the light for the majority of his life. He's had enough of that light. And so he has energy in the tank. He has reserves that he can draw upon. It's not perfect, but he gets through this difficult passage of time, 2 or 3 years, and now he's doing great. He has a girlfriend. He's going to move in with her. They're going to reproduce and have lots of smart babies, yada, yada, yada. And this is the power of the Matthew effect. So I'm just making this up. Let's say this guy had 75% success, 25% failure. That is enough to propel him forwards. But for other individuals, where it's the inverse, 25% success, 75% failure, it's much more difficult. And to people who have no success, the tank was never filled up to begin with. There's nothing to draw upon. And you throw into this mix differentiated levels of resilience, ability to deal with things that are genetic in origin, and you can end up with very, very different outcomes. And yet people dismiss this routinely, especially when you're as smart, as capable as this guy, who was insisting to me that anyone can do what he did, and anyone can succeed ultimately in the same way. And I think anyone is a bit of an exaggeration. Some people can, but many people can't. And I discussed this to some degree with Sir Petey the Punani Slayer not too long ago. The fact that some people have had so much negative in their Matthew effect that the only way to break that negativity loop would be external intervention of a proportion scarcely imaginable. I can give you another example of the opposite of this mathematics genius guy that I encountered. I met a morbidly obese woman, age 32, who allegedly at least had a number of psychoses or mental issues, borderline personality disorder, bipolar depression, manic depression, anxiety disorder, and never left her house. And this has been ongoing for 14 years. What is the likelihood that this person is somehow going to break out of this bubble? It's pretty low. I wouldn't say it's non-existent, but she would need constant help, constant aid. And frankly speaking, she's already tried a number of times. So is she likely to succeed long term? No. And of course, in the case of the aforementioned individual, their tank was never full to begin with. Good example of somebody who has no extra reserves. Now, this concerns me above all inasmuch as it concerns men in general and young men specifically, because at the moment we have a society that is geared in most ways against the nature and interests of male human beings. Of course, some succeed, but there are many who are left behind. Many who are not even that debilitated, but because of how things have been structured, such as schools, as an example, they have no opportunity. And so I have to reiterate this. If we want people to get out of their negative Matthew effect loop, it's unlikely that most of them will be able to do it on their own. And that's especially true of young guys. I've talked about this before. It's nothing new, but it is true that aid rendered unto men is seen as hostile to women, is seen as something being denied to women. What men gain, they view, women lose. Now, whether or not this perception is accurate, who knows? But I've talked about the notion of intersexual resource competition before. It's something I strongly believe in. I think it exists above all in the modern context. And although men and women don't obviously compete against each other reproductively, they certainly compete for resources, money, scholarships, medical aid, etc., etc. And there's a kind of sick humor to it all because we have no qualms about giving every form of aid and help to women imaginable, all the while praising them for their virtue, prowess, and abilities, and the idea that men might need help, whilst criticizing them constantly, denigrating them, is seen as absolutely absurd. Of course, this comes down to the empathy gap. It comes down to human nature. Men need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and women can get all the help in the world and still be amazing. Such is the nature of the world. If collectively we're unwilling to give men any form of aid that would propel them forward, or consider things that would at least level the playing field to some degree, something that people have no qualms about with respect to women, then I think this is going to just press upon the already at times extant negative Matthew effect loop and make things even worse for the men in question. But more broadly, I think it would be beneficial for people to be aware of the Matthew effect and the effects it has on people. That would be particularly true of parents and people involved in education across all levels, because although it's very difficult to aid somebody, it's very easy to mess them up, which is something ideally you want to prevent in order to prevent the worst effects of the negative Matthew effect downward spiral. Ultimately, this leads to the type of cultural speciation I've addressed many times on this channel, the separation of fellow human beings, and indeed a general antipathy that emerges between people who are in completely different wavelengths because they have gone through different lives and have suffered or benefited from either a negative or positive Matthew effect, respectively. As always, thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to my patrons. As always, thank you very much. Really appreciate your support. And if you can go through the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, subscribing, supporting the channel by comments or sharing, much appreciated as well. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.